What's up YouTube, this is tcgsam here, and in today's video I wanted to do a quick mid-format meta update where I go over some of the results that we've had from recent tournaments. Since we are a little bit into the burst protocol format, I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at some things that may have changed from the start of the format. In particular, I'm going to be looking at deck lists from the two most recent events at the time of recording, being YCS Sydney and the YCS in Mexico. I'll be going over any interesting decks or tech choices, and I'll talk about exactly what you need to do as a competitive player of this format to keep up. So without any further ado, let's hop straight into it, starting off with the YCS Sydney results. Looking at the top 8 breakdown, lots of Dracotail, Radiant Typhoon, Vanquishable, makes sense, we've seen these decks before. There is one outlier here, and that's going to be the DDD deck. I think this one is more so an outlier as opposed to DDD actually being a very good deck. Although I will say, like, when I personally played against DDD, it was pretty difficult to stop it at times. It's a very flexible and resilient deck. I think this deck does have a pretty big problem when going second. Its own engine is a little bit fragile and isn't able to break through boards super consistently, but going first, like, this deck can play through a bunch of hand traps, and going first is going to be able to set up an almost unbreakable end board. And so I think that, especially since people are not really preparing for these like super heavy combo decks, they're playing half board breakers, only hand traps like Fua, Perulia, Ash, it may not be enough to fully stop the DDD deck. The DDD deck usually gets to set up almost uninterrupted. This was kind of just as a result of people not really respecting these big combo decks and either putting hand traps only in the side deck or just not playing a super high amount of them in the first place. I don't think this deck's going to be particularly meta relevant. It might be like a very solid tier 2 deck that will pop up here or there at regionals, but I don't think this is a deck you actively need to side for. I think it's just important to be aware that there are still these very combo heavy decks that are going to do well in the current format. I don't think you can completely take out hand traps from your main deck just yet, and depending on the deck, you might even be able to play more hand traps, because this deck is something that may be able to play through higher impact hand traps like Droll fairly decently, but just a single copy of like Imprimatur or Link 2 can really hamper this deck. Very quickly going over some of the other lists from YCS Sydney. The Dracotail list that got second place is fairly standard for the Branded Dracotail deck. Maybe the only interesting thing to talk about is that they were playing one copy of regular Fall in the Albaz and only 2 copies of Fall in the White. This is kind of one of the only things that separates like the Branded Dracotail decks, is whether or not they play OG Albaz. If you play OG Albaz, of course you are adding an extra brick into your deck, but it does raise the ceiling of your deck a lot. And when you're going up against Branded Dracotail, I think it's important to really try to scout out for whether or not they have access to OG Albaz, because if they do, something like a Cartesia Synchro on the end board does become an additional interruption for them. A card like Ecclesia going second can threaten to fuse away your board right away with a card like Albaz. And so by playing the Albaz, it gives the deck a lot more interruptions that they're able to set up, and it makes it so like the recurring Branded pieces like the Ecclesia Synchro aren't just sitting there and really not really doing anything in other builds that aren't necessarily playing the OG Albaz. Do I think you have to play OG Albaz in the deck? No, you can definitely play 3 copies of Fall in the White and the deck will still be very good. But if you feel like in some of those more simplified game states where let's say you only have the Branded cards and no Dracotail cards, it can be something that's really good. And so just be aware that when you're playing as Branded Dracotail, some of them may be playing OG Albaz in there. In terms of like the Radiant Typhoon decks, the only interesting thing I can see is like Lava Golem in the side deck, so that does end up being pretty good against combo decks like DDD. It also happens to overlap against the Lunalight deck as well, so if Radiant Typhoon players are starting to put in cards like Lava Golem into their side deck, it can be pretty hard to play a deck like Lunalight in my opinion. Speaking of Lunalight, it's a deck that's still going to be very powerful. A lot of decks just don't have a built-in way to out Liger, and if you're able to go first and set that up, you pretty much just win the game a lot of the times. Yummy is also something that wasn't super popular at YCS Sydney, but in the next tournament I'll talk about at YCS Mexico, you'll see it was a lot more popular and ended up taking a lot more slots in the top cut. But in terms of where Yummy is right now, there are a couple ways to play. You can play it pure, like the list that you have here, with just a bunch of non-engine, or you could mix in other engines, which once again I'll go over in the next tournament that we cover. Malice is of course still going to be pretty relevant in this format, even without a card like Whitebinder. Although that being said, I think it's gotten to a point where Malice is a deck you don't necessarily have to side deck any specific cards like Artifact Lancia for. If you have the space, like great, you can play it and you can have that hit both Malice and the Lunalight deck. But if you just have generic cards in your side deck like Ghost Spell, Imperm, Perulia, those can be decent enough against the Malice deck and give your deck enough of a chance even when Malice is able to go first. And then finally, there have been a few Azamina variants popping up. The White Force one here I think is maybe the most common version you're going to see, because they have access to that new Dark Magician fusion that allows them to basically summon it for free by tributing away one of their higher level spellcasters that's able to search a spell that's going to help them be able to fusion summon into Dragoon, and that Dragoon is able to not only be a very, very powerful endboard piece, but it insulates their combos early on. And so it's important to note against any of these like Azamina spellcaster pile decks that they're going to have access to a negate for very early on to their combo. So you want to structure your hand traps in a way that's able to play around that. All right, for the next tournament that did recently just happen, the Team YCS in Mexico, I think, had some more interesting results than YCS Sydney. You'll notice the top cut breakdown here is still dominated by Dracotail, of course, but a deck like Yummy is represented a lot more in this top cut than it was in the previous YCS. I think that's just an indication of where the meta slowly started to shift towards. The first place team did have this Radiant Typhoon Tri-Brigade Yummy deck, which I'll quickly show over here. This is almost like the definition of combo pile. You can bridge from Radiant Typhoon into the Yummy, you can bridge from Yummy to Radiant Typhoon. Of course, this deck's still able to run very high numbers of non-engine as well, which is very strong for the deck. So this deck should have not a terrible time going second. Like I was talking about in the DDD section, because people have started to slowly take hand traps either out of the main deck or only putting them to the side, or just not playing hand traps like the Biru to begin with. I think a deck like this can sort of get away with leaning more on the combo heavy side of Yu-Gi-Oh, because they're just not going to be able to be stopped most of the times. And honestly, the end board that this deck sets up is pretty resilient to most board breakers. So I think that moving forward, combo variants of Yummy like this could potentially be more popular, or at the very least, it's going to force a meta shift where players are going to start having to put back those hand traps into their side deck at the very least, so they're not just completely blown out when this deck has to go first. In terms of other interesting things about this list, something that stands out is like the new addition of Camellia, of course. This just means anytime they're able to get 2 bodies on the board, they're able to make Camellia, dump drones, make Kagari, add back drones, and then that bridges to the Yummy engine. So worst case scenario, you also have an additional bridge back into the Yummy engine, even if you aren't able to access like your Tri-Brigade stuff, which I think is pretty cool considering the engine is just 1 copy of drones and then 2 cards in the extra deck. In terms of side deck, something that's very interesting is Illusion Gate. This is a fairly new card that hasn't really been seeing too much play, but Illusion Gate I think is very interesting because it not only acts as a pretty solid board breaker. I mean, it's basically just Raigeki at the cost of half your life points. It also has that very key bonus effect of being able to summon one of your opponent's monsters from their grave to your field. This can matter a lot if you're playing like a mirror match. You're able to take, for example, a Yummy monster and just go off into your own Yummy combo, which can be pretty solid. It's not like this card negates the effects of the monsters you steal as well. So if you end up stealing like a Radiant Typhoon monster, you get that monster's effect. There's honestly a lot of upsides to playing Illusion Gate. I would say maybe the only real downside I think is like, of course, that Raigeki effect's not going to be super relevant against some decks. Like for example, against a Dracotail deck, I don't think this card is like particularly high impact, but I assume it was here for a lot of those other combo decks. And especially since this deck is taking advantage of so many engines like Yummy and Radiant Typhoon, most of the meta matchups it's going to play against, it's going to take full advantage of that stealing effect. So just be aware that this is a board breaker that people are slowly starting to put into their decks. So in terms of some of the other decks that ended up topping this YCS, I think an interesting one is like the pure Branded Despia deck. This is a deck that I think is not very popular because it is pretty hard to pilot at a high level, but in the hands of a very good pilot, this deck is like just as strong as a deck like Branded Dracotail, even though it doesn't have that Dracotail engine in it. I think my biggest problem with this deck is still going to be that it doesn't have the most room for non-engine, so going second does kind of feel coin flippy. This deck has ways to play through boards, but it's not perfect because if they run into like a very combo heavy deck like that Yummy pile that we just saw, it's probably going to struggle when going second. So I think that's maybe the biggest thing that's holding this deck back. But other than that, it's still a very solid going first deck. It's pretty resilient to common hand traps. And of course, it's able to take advantage of Fallen the White Dragon, which is one of the best cards in the format. Something else that was pretty interesting, one of the top 4 teams was exclusively playing Fiends with Yummy. And I think this still just goes to show how powerful the Yummy engine is. I know some people may have overlooked it after our last ban list, having Snatchy hit to 1. But Yummy is definitely still going to be a very relevant deck. Not only does it still have very powerful 1-card combos, well, once you start pairing it with other powerful engines as well, you just kind of get the best of both worlds because the Yummy engine is really just not restrictive at all. I think the Radiant Typhoon Tri-Brigade variant is a little bit better since there's a little bit more of a clean synergy between the Yummy deck and its supplementary engines here as opposed to the Fiendsmith engine here. All of that being said though, it's not like the Fiendsmith engine can't go back into the Yummy engine. Basically, any single deck that has a Yummy engine can bridge into it as long as they can make a link to, because they can go Camellia, Camellia dumps the drones, Kagari add back drones, and then boom, there you go, you have Cups of Yummy. Just be aware that now that I think we have Camellia, Yummy is probably going to be popping up a lot more, and it's going to be splashed with a lot of other decks as well. Something else that's interesting about this top cut, I mean, there was a team that had a Mermail player on it, which honestly is pretty shocking to me. I don't think Mermail's a terrible deck by any means, but I feel like it sort of falls in a similar category as DDD. It is one of those combo heavy decks where, okay, if your opponent's not prepared for it, you can completely wipe them out. And maybe Mermail's even better than DDD because it has that going second potential built right into its engine. But that being said though, Mermail is one of those like multi-card combo decks like DDD where it requires multiple moving pieces, and that can be hard if your opponent is on a high count of hand traps. Something else that's also interesting, like Fire King, this is not a deck we've seen for a while. I think it's probably still like rogue status, but just having these two decks like pop up in the top 8, I think just goes to show that there are quite a few decks that can still be pretty viable in the current format. So we still have a fairly open format. Yes, there are dominant decks like Dracotail, Yummy variants, but outside of those, there's still decks that are able to compete at the highest level, and I think that's something that's pretty good about this current format. And I think that pretty much wraps up all the interesting things I wanted to talk about in terms of these two tournaments. And so to sum things all up, like what should you do as a competitive player given this information? I think the first thing is to just be aware of all the new meta developments as they come out. There are like almost new innovations, new tech cards that are popping out almost every single tournament that we play, especially because this format is so open. Like I said, there are decks that are going to be good for sure, but there are also potential sleeper decks that people are experimenting with and going to do well with at lower level tournaments like regionals. And so I would really recommend as a competitive player to stay up to date on that by like just very quickly taking a look at recent regional results to see if any really interesting decks have popped up or if anyone was playing any interesting tech cards. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the resurgence of these very combo heavy pile decks. You probably do need to put some hand traps back into either your main deck or your side deck if you were just on a mostly board breaker approach. Of course, not every deck's going to be able to do this, but I think for the decks that have the option between the two, like for example Branded Dracotail, it's probably going to be pretty beneficial for you to at least have some higher count of hand traps that you can side into when you do play against these decks. Alright, so that's going to do it for this video. Let me know what you guys thought about it in the comment section below. This is a different style of video than I usually make, but let me know if you're interested in seeing more of these mid-format updates in the future, where I just basically go over recent results and how the metagame has been developing lately. Before I end off the video, I also want to give a quick shout out to Card Trader. You can check them out using my affiliate link in the description below and use code tcgsam for 5% off your entire order while helping to support the channel. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.